be up on top. And there we go, Dan. And go.
Good evening and welcome to the 555th episode of Travelers Radio. I'm Dan Schlossberg along with my friend and producer Roger Noriega, and we are in the 13th season of Travelers Radio, the show that lets you enjoy the pleasures of travel from the comfort of your armchair.
Every week at this time, we talk to people representing destinations, hotels, airlines, railroads, car rental companies, and others in the world of travel and hospitality, from authors and bloggers to broadcasters and publicists. If it's got anything to do with travel, it's got everything to do with Travelers Radio.
And our guest tonight is Dan Conlon, curator of temporary and traveling exhibitions at the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21. Welcome, Dan, to Travelers Radio.
Talk to you, Dan and Roger.
Dan, immigration is a big issue in the United States now more than ever. Is it also the same in Canada?
Immigration is one, the big topical issues of the day. In Canada, over long periods of time, there's actually been a very strong support for immigration as key to Canada's economic success and growth. And we've seen that over kind of many decades. Now, in times of like high unemployment, there'll be a sort of resistance to immigration. More recently, we've had concerns about the impact of immigration on housing, but the support for immigration in Canada has really consistently remained very high. Canadians are particularly really proud of their role in settling refugees, those who are fleeing persecution overseas. And Canada has kind of led the world in sort of per capita admission to refugees. So we put a lot of stock in the future of the country being kind of driven by the skills, hopes, ambition, and the hard work of immigrants, and have very high levels of immigration in Canada.
Is it, first of all, where is the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21, and why was it located there?
Located in the port city of Halifax on Canada's east coast, Atlantic coast. Halifax has one of the largest natural harbors in the world, and it's a big, beautiful ice-free harbor that's very close to the North Atlantic shipping lanes, and it never silts up, never freezes up. So it's a great place for ships to dock. And so that made us a major port for the largest ocean liners in the world to arrive. And so Canada built its biggest immigration terminal in Halifax. And when the ocean liners stopped coming and people started flying, the old ocean liner facility eventually became Canada's National Immigration Museum. And so that's where our museum is located here. It's where the big ships used to come. And we're kind of Canada's version of Ellis Island, a major destination during peak periods of immigration for ships bringing immigrants in the era when people traveled by sea.
Is it true that it's just one of two national museums in Canada located outside the national capital region?
Like most countries, we have a big cluster of national museums in our capital city in Ottawa and Ontario. But in recent years, there's been a move to create some national museums outside of the capital city. So the city of Winnipeg has Canada's Human Rights Museum just looking at human rights issues in Canada. And Halifax, because of the historic ocean liner terminal, has Canada's National Museum of Immigration, where I work. So we're the two national museums that are outside the main national capital, where you find, the National Gallery, the Canadian War Museum, the Canadian Museum of History.
During the heyday of European immigration to Canada, about how many people were processed at the Halifax location?
So Halifax had about 4 million people arrive. And for a small country, that's a high volume people coming through one port. Pier 21 was built in 1928. It replaced an earlier terminal that saw about 3 million people. And then while Pier 21 was in operation from 1928 to 1971, we had just under 1 million people who came through our doors. And largest number of that were sort of in that immediate post-World War II period. So that was an intense period of post-war immigration to North America. And lots of those families are still around and still have very passionate connections to where they arrived or where father and grandmother arrived. So that's really put us on the immigration sort of cultural landmark for Canada.
The same location was used as a port of debarkation during World War II for soldiers and sailors heading overseas. About how many were involved?
Yeah, well, the same reasons that made the port such a great place for immigrant ships to bring people to Canada also made it a critical wartime port for troop ships and convoy ships leaving for the battlefields of Europe. So in World War II, about 425,000 Canadians went overseas to fight in battles and for the Army, Navy, and Air Force. And they almost all left from Pier 21 in hundreds of troop ships. So the wartime period in Pier 21, although immigration fell away, all these troops moving overseas, the wounded coming back from the battlefields, plus VIPs like Winston Churchill arriving, or gold reserves from European countries that were being overrun by Nazis, that all came through Pier 21. So a crucial port during the war. And as I mentioned, 425,000 Canadians boarded troop ships. Over 45,000 of them never came back. They were killed in battle. So as well as being a powerful place where people made their first footsteps on North America, Pier 21 is also the last place where many Canadians left overseas and never came back. So it's a real, the fact that you could actually walk the floors where people had their first or last steps in Canada makes it a very, very powerful place to visit.
We're talking with Dan Conlon of the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21. The museum is marking its 25th anniversary this year, Dan. Does the location still process immigrants to Canada, or is it strictly a museum to their original arrival?
The immigrants stopped coming in 1971 when everybody switching to flying. The immigration terminal closed April the 1st, 1971, and now immigrants to Canada come through airports, just like they come to the United States through airports. So we don't see immigrants arriving for Canada. We do see lots of ships because nowadays we have cruise ships. Instead of the immigrant ocean liners, we have get over 200 cruise ships a year. So they tie up exactly where the immigrant ships used to tie up. Except nowadays, instead of boarding trains to their new home, they get on tour buses to visit areas around Nova Scotia. So it's still cool that we still get the big ships, but they're not immigrant ships anymore.
What is Pier 21 and why is it considered the gateway to North America?
We're the last standing ocean immigration terminal in Canada. There were other ocean terminals where ships came at Quebec City and Montreal, Victoria, BC. Those terminals have all over the years been demolished. Pier 21, the building is still intact. And so you can still step ashore at the gateway area where the gangways once came in and walk through the assembly room where people waited for their names to be called. It's a really powerful place where people began lives in North America. And Pier 21 was particularly important in that period right after World War II when the masses of people immigrating from Europe came to North America. That big post-war immigration that was kind of key to Canada's economic success and a big part of America's post-war growth. So that big flush of people coming after World War II in the sort of last generation of ocean liner crossings kind of made Pier 21, a really important last landmark of that era of people coming to North America by sea.
Both the U.S. and Canada have a shared history as immigrant receiving countries, but conditions were different. How is arriving at Pier 21 different than arriving at Ellis Island in the Port of New York?
A number of interesting differences. Ellis Island was built earlier in the 1890s, and it was built with kind of grand Baroque style of buildings, big domes, etc. Pier 21 was built sort of in the more restrained industrial style of the 1920s. So the building's not quite as grand. One advantage Pier 21 had was it's on the mainland, so you could get off your ship, go through customs and immigration's health inspection, and then walk right onto a train. Ellis Island's on an island, once you pass through the immigration process in New York Harbor, then you had to actually take a ferry to find a train station. And so Pier 21 kind of offered a more streamlined, all on kind of one roof experience for immigrants. So that was kind of an important difference. Also, because Ellis Island was in operation earlier, it was from an earlier period where there was not quite as much overseas processing done. Pier 21, by the time it opened, a lot of the paperwork was done in Europe. And immigrants filed their paperwork, did their health inspection in Europe. And that meant the level of deportation from Pier 21 was very low. It's kind of less than 1%, because all the important things had been sort of processed ahead of time, thanks to things like a telegraph and modern communication systems. So the deportation experience was lesser at Pier 21 than it was at Ellis Island. But the two sites share many things. In terms of arriving in a new country is always a stressful, emotional time, it can be a joyful time, but it's also a trepidatious time where you're sort of wondering if you're going to get into the new country, what your life is going to be there. So the sites both share that kind of landmark in people's personal journeys.
I understand, Dan, that some people that were going to the U.S. arrived in Halifax, and some people bound for Canada arrived in New York. Why was that sometimes the case?
It's kind of like when you're flying to Europe. You may go to Heathrow, you may go to Paris, you may go to Frankfurt. It all depends on sort of the line that you're traveling on. So many Americans found that the railway connections to the Midwest worked really well. If you were coming to a Canadian port, you could avoid the congestion of places like New York and get on your way to its Midwestern locations. So a lot of Midwestern U.S. immigrants actually came through Canadian ports. Conversely, a lot of Canadians would sometimes find the volume of big ocean liners going to a place like New York City made it sort of cheaper or faster to go to New York and then take a train up to Canada. So we have those multiple sort of connections shared between the two countries. And both the U.S. and the Canadian Immigration Service had satellite offices. So Pier 21 once had a large office where the American immigration officials would kind of welcome American immigrants and travelers and kind of process them. And Ellis Island had a Canadian contingent looking for Canadian immigrants as well. So there was that interesting kind of shared cross-border transfer of traffic.
Pier 21 only stopped operating as an immigration ocean terminal in 1971. There are many people with living memories of arriving, working, or volunteering at Pier 21. Can you share some of those stories that have stuck with you?
It's really powerful to meet these families, these first-person connections. We have little stickers we give them that's called the alumni stickers, and it's for people who have that direct connection. And it's really something to see them walk into what we call the gateway area, that's where the gangways came out, and you could look out on the ocean and just imagine the ships there and people taking their first steps. And we frequently have people bursting into tears or falling to their knees because they're remembering that powerful emotional connection of arriving in Canada for the first time. So it's amazing to meet those older immigrants and their families. They have many stories. Frequently, they were just so happy to be on solid land and away from seasickness. The North Atlantic can be a rough place to travel in the wintertime, so they were really happy to be on land. People often tell us how nervous they were. They're sitting in a bench waiting for your name to be called when you're called up to this desk to a man who opens your passport and then checks your papers. And people were really nervous, and there was often a long wait, waiting for your name to be called. And people would be afraid to go to the washroom, worried that, what if they call my name and I'm not here? And then there's lots of stories we hear from people about adventures and misadventures. I remember one Dutch family telling us they were watching their luggage be lifted from the ship in a big rope bundle and lifted off the ship, and it was coming towards the pier, and then the rope broke, and they watched their luggage go into Halifax Harbor. That was a bit of a shock. People often also remember the kindness that somebody. We had a lot of post-war immigrants who arrived with very little, Holocaust survivors, people fleeing countries they couldn't live anymore, and people advancing them like $5 to buy a meal, and kind of everything that kind of changed. They had a wonderful program at Pier 21. The immigration officers would often give people informal loans, just so that they'd have kind of spending money to get to their new home. And then people would mail them checks almost 100% of the time, repaying those informal loans. I've also heard great stories from immigrants about smuggling food in. Many people like to bring food from their homeland when you immigrate. And we had quite strict agricultural laws. You couldn't bring in meat products because it might spread hoof and mouth disease, and you couldn't bring in seeds because they might have funguses. And so people are trying to bring in, beautiful, tasty sausages from Germany or cured meats from Italy. That they would hide them in secret compartments in their coats, and then the immigration people would try to figure out where the food was hidden. And we're doing a whole exhibit that opens next year about the history of food and immigration, and those food smuggling stories are often quite funny. One story I once heard from an immigration officer was they found an immigrant from Italy, and he had a tin of lard. And the immigration officers often knew people would try to hide things in lard because nobody wants to go through lard. So they opened up the tin. The immigration officer stirred his finger around, and they pulled out a rolled up bundle of $700 tied up in the lard. And the poor immigrant who didn't speak any English was terrified that he might be charged with smuggling and money. But the immigration officer handed him back his money and said, "You're welcome to bring as much money as you want into Canada. Good luck to you, but we're keeping your lard because it's a banned product." So you can imagine that gives you an idea of the roller coaster of emotions that you could get from immigrants arriving, and these initial experiences in a new country, and all the hoops you have to jump through when you're starting a new life.
I want to tell our listeners and viewers, you're tuned to Travelwitch Radio, now in our 13th season with Dan Schlossberg and Roger Noriega. Check us out on iTunes, LinkedIn, Instagram, or the Travelwitch Radio Facebook page, among other places. And we're talking with Dan Conlon of the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21.
Dan, I would like to take a moment. I want to welcome ARC 54 and Lethal Migraine. They have asked questions. I hope you don't mind. I'd like to get to that first one. Will the Empress of Ireland exhibition return at any point to the museum?
That was a special exhibition about a terrible shipwreck in 1914, Canada's Titanic. It was an exhibition created by our sister museum, the Canadian Museum of History in Ottawa. They created it just for that anniversary year in 2014. We took it in 2015. It was, however, alas, a special, just kind of one-shot deal. So, it was a great exhibit, a really powerful exhibit about a ship that was brought tens of thousands of people to Canada, but then those objects went back to Ottawa. So, we mentioned the Empress of Ireland in a number of our kind of displays. That exhibit won't be coming back. You can see some of those objects at the Canadian Museum of History in Canada's national capital.
Excellent. I'd like to get to one more. Lethal Migraine was asking earlier when you were discussing it, does the government help keep Pier 21 a functional place, or is it all a private endeavor?
Museum that's funded by the federal government. So it's we get our funding from the federal government. We're an independent museum. We're kind of what we call in Canada a crown corporation. So we have our own board and choose our own history, but we get good funding from Canadian taxpayers to tell this really important Canadian story about how immigration has shaped Canada and the contributions of immigrants. And of course, we raise lots of our own money from the ticket prices that visitors share with us, and from donations. But we're a federally supported museum, and it gives you an idea just how important immigration is in Canada. That one of the 7 national museums just looks at the history of Canada through immigration to the country.
What would a visitor to the museum experience today? How long a visit should they plan if they're going there?
Well, we've got 2 amazing core galleries, and then we have a variety of really interesting temporary shows located in where the ships used to tie up. So we got one giant exhibit that looks at the big picture of immigration from 1604, the beginning of permanent European settlement, right up to the present day and everything in between, right across the country. So real high-tech, hands-on gallery. And then we have another exhibit gallery that looks just at the building, the story of Pier 21 between 1928 and 1971. The people who came through this building, the ships that came here, what immigration was like during that big boom post-war period. So we have these 2 big galleries and often a really interesting temporary show. Visitors, we have to talk about different types of visitors. Sometimes we call them streakers, strollers, and scholars. Scholars are people who are really into their history, and we regularly have people spend half a day here. We have a lovely lunchroom cafe where people can kind of recharge, and people who are really into Canadian history or just the immigration experience, including a lot of Americans who look for the parallels between the experience of coming to the northern part of North America. They'll spend a half day or more here. The more streakers and strollers who are in a hurry, 2 hours is often a good sample for the museum. That allows people to take in some of our guided tours. We have regular guided tours. We also have two major video features, sit-down sort of theaters that look at the experience of people coming. One looks at the experience of people coming to Canada in recent years, where people come from across the world, the challenges and accomplishments in Canada. And then we have a really cool curved, almost 3D theater that looks at immigrant contribution, major players in Canadian business, arts, culture, and science and sports who are many Canadians know them because they're famous, but they don't know they were immigrants. And so we have those video features that people often want to take in. From half a day or more to an hour or two, we kind of cater to all kinds of visitors.
You've already given us quite a bit of information. Hopefully, I'm not asking something you already answered, but what are the absolute must-see things at the museum that you would encourage people not to miss?
When I mentioned that area where we call Gateway, where the gangways once came down and where it's the doors that opened into the assembly hall, that's a really powerful place with a beautiful view of Halifax Harbor, and that's one of the things that it's an awe-inspiring area. You can just feel a hush when people walk into that space, so that's a really powerful part of the museum. We have a really cool ocean liner cabin where we've created a cabin with bunks and a sink that looks just like the sort of bare bones third-class tourism quarters that most immigrants had, and that's a real cool kind of space. And we've created a railway car. There were special railway cars Canada built just for immigrants called colonist cars, and they would take people from Pier 21 to that 2, 3, 4, 7-day journey across Canada, because Canada, like the U.S., is a big place. So often your immigration voyage started in Canada on a train, and we have this really neat train with windows and sound effects and people talking about those railway journeys. People can sit down. I often see families who are kind of tired parking themselves in the railway seats with their kids and kind of thinking about their journeys other people made in Canada for the first time. And then that contribution video I mentioned, it's this kind of curved screen with a really amazing graphics that introduce you to a whole range of movers and shakers in Canada who were immigrants. And that's a real attraction not to be missed.
Wow. Wow. Historically, since the Titanic sunk off the coast of Newfoundland, did any items from that shipwreck find their way to the museum?
Now, Halifax as a port city has a really interesting connection to Titanic. The survivors almost came here, but at the last moment, the Carpathia, the rescue ship, took them to New York. But interestingly enough, a whole bunch of American immigration officials arrived in Halifax expecting to process survivors from Titanic, and then they discovered they went to New York and they had to take their stamps and all their immigration paperwork back to New York. But what Halifax did get was the victims of Titanic. After the ship sank, the North Atlantic was carpeted with hundreds of floating corpses. And the White Star Line hired 3 different ships from Halifax to go out and look for the victims of Titanic. All those bodies came to Halifax and are buried in 3 different cemeteries in the city. And also wreckage from the ship, shattered beautiful woodwork, floating deck chairs. Those were brought back to the city and kept by the sailors who searched for the bodies. So and then the city saw weeks and weeks of grieving families arriving by train to identify the bodies of their loved ones and either see them buried in Halifax or ship the bodies across North America to the homes they were hoping to arrive at. So there's quite a powerful connection between Titanic and Halifax. The Titanic sinking occurred before Pier 21 opened up, but we had an interesting Titanic sister ship, the RMS Olympic. Dead ringer to Titanic. She came to Pier 21 all the time because, unlike her sister ship, Olympic had a long career and was around when Pier 21 opened. So we have great shots of it. It looks like Titanic's tied up at our museum, but it's actually her sister ship. So there's a real powerful connection. And I think for many people, Titanic embodies that transatlantic era of people with their hopes and dreams from all classes of life, packed in a floating city crossing the Atlantic. We know about Titanic because it was a dramatic disaster, but it's kind of a sort of a time capsule of the immigration experience, which is very much a story we tell at Pier 21.
You mentioned a few ships right now. So what big name ships, in addition to those, came to call at Pier 21? Of course, we're talking the queens of the Cunard line, for example, like Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary.
So because we could have this amazing long deep harbor, so we had all the biggest ships in the world, as you mentioned, the legendary Queen Mary and then Queen Elizabeth. We still love to see the modern day cruise ship Queen Mary 2. She's arriving on July 1st this year. She's always a nice visitor because she kind of looks a bit like her older ships. But also, big legendary ships like RMS Mauritania. Aquitania was the last big four-stacker of the sort of the Titanic era. She had a long career into late 1940s, and she came to Pier 21 a lot with that rush of post-war immigrants. Some big, beautiful French liners like the Ile-de-France. And one ship whose name is quite famous, but in kind of an infamous way, was the motor ship St. Louis. Big, beautiful, modern German liner. St. Louis made her maiden voyage to Pier 21 in the 1920s, and then kind of came to Pier 21 all the time on normal voyages, but then made this tragic refugee voyage in 1939, where almost 1,000 Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazis got on this one German ship called the St. Louis, and they thought they were going to safely escape Hitler and go to Cuba. But while they were at sea, Cuba turned them down, and then the United States decided not to admit them. And then Canada, where the ship normally called, decided not to admit them. And the poor refugees aboard the St. Louis, they kind of went around in circles on the east coast of North America, hoping for sanctuary. In the end, both the U.S. and Canada said no, and the St. Louis had to return to Europe, where a quarter of the passengers died in the Holocaust. That's a really tragic story associated with Canadian and U.S. immigration. Making the wrong decision about refugee policies. We have a monument to that ship and her tragic voyage right in the entrance, because it says a lot about how to do refugee and immigration the wrong way. And so it's a compelling story that we always kind of keep in mind.
I thank you for sharing that story with us today. When immigration in Canada was at its peak, roughly how many ships per week came to Pier 21?
In the sort of the peak era in the 50s of post-war immigration, it was like 100,000 people a year were coming through Pier 21. Sort of in one week, it might see a dozen ships. I think the record was there was one day that there were 7 ships who all arrived in one day. There were so many they couldn't all tie up at once. A whole bunch of them were anchored in the harbor, and they came first thing in the morning when it was still dark, and they were still unloading passengers right up till midnight because they had their kind of wait their turn. So you could have some incredibly busy days, and the immigration staff would be all working all kinds of overtime. And people would be spending long times waiting in those benches, boarding trains well into the night. And then some days you would get a break, or there'd be no ship, and people could catch up on all their immigration paperwork. And then the next day there'd be 2 or 3 ships in the same day. So in that period, you saw large numbers of ships. Sometimes there'd be a strike in New York. The tugboats or the longshoremen in New York would go on strike. And when that happened, all those big New York ships would come up to Halifax, and that could also kind of mean a really busy times in Halifax. Pier 21 is kind of fortunate in terms of it had excellent railway connections. There was a huge rail yard and a train station right next to Pier 21, so you could mobilize dozens and dozens of trains in one day to move thousands of people very quickly. And that was one of its assets as an immigration terminal.
I can imagine where the immigrants came from. Irish, English, and everywhere else were aboard those ships, right?
Well, Pier 21 was in business from 1928 to 1971. There was a big focus on European immigration. Government policy favored that, and kind of discouraged people from coming from places like Asia or Africa. And there were all kinds of rules, written and unwritten, that focused mainly on Europe. But then there were people who managed to come. There was a surprising number of people from the Middle East who managed to come to Canada in that period, where the focus was on Europe, but people managed to sort of convince the government that they had the skills and the assets to make good immigrants. And then it was kind of a trickle of immigration that began from places like the West Indies when Pier 21 was operating. People trying to sort of beginning to break the color barrier. Canada created something called the point system in the 1960s, where they stopped looking at basically race and ethnicity and started looking at, what kind of education do you have? What are your professional qualifications?
Mhm.
Kind of what's your health? Those things that would make you a successful immigrant, regardless of your country of origin. And when we shifted to the point system, the immigration to Canada really changed, become more global. And so, today the number one sources of countries of immigrants to Canada are places like India and China, and they're kind of big economic drivers in terms of skill, business, and professional activities in Canada.
We've seen a few of the images on screen, but I imagine everything that's at the museum. Where were the photographs and artifacts on display at the museum? Where'd they come from?
We have a big collection of our own. Immigrants are often very generous in giving us photos and documents, and we have more steamer trunks and suitcases than you can imagine. People often keep those iconic pieces of luggage. And many families have generously shared objects with us. We have a whole collection unit that tries to figure out, what's the best donation offer to match up with our collection. So we have a lot of powerful objects that that immigrants have given us, like a lovely teddy bear, or a wedding dress that was worn by a war bride who married a Canadian soldier overseas. These iconic objects that people brought with them, the baby carriage that they were brought ashore at Pier 21 when they were a little tiny infant. So we have these objects that immigrants have donated to us. We also have great relationships with other Canadian national museums. So we'll borrow things from some of our national sister museums, like the Canadian Museum of History, even the Hockey Hall of Fame. There's a number of famous Canadian hockey players or immigrants. One of my favorite objects in our collection is we have the NHL star player Stan Mikita. We have his hockey stick, and he was
Wow.
just a teenager from the Czech Republic from Czechoslovakia who arrived, didn't speak any English, was just a young teenager, came over all by himself, was bullied at school, and then he discovered hockey. And he became this major NHL star. Fans of Wayne's World will probably remember Stan Mikita. He features in that movie as kind of a player for the Chicago Blackhawks. So we've got his hockey stick on loan from the Canadian Hockey Hall of Fame. So immigration connects with people's lives and accomplishments in all kinds of different ways. So we kind of try to present iconic objects that will make people think about immigrant journeys that way.
I understand you offer family research services at the museum. What kinds of things can visitors discover?
We have a note a part of the museum. It's kind of an immigration family history library called the Scotiabank Family History Center. And it's staffed with like experts in doing genealogical research. And they
Wow.
can often take the barest information from people saying, my grandpa's name was Fred, and we think he came in the 1930s. And they will puzzle through the paper trail. We have access to really important document databases. We have sort of all the family history sort of search indexes, and we can often put together a real good history about, when your ancestor arrived, what ship he was on, where he kind of went, and kind of give people a real snapshot about their ancestors' arrival. And often people can actually even buy a little sort of picture of the ship that their immigrants came on right in that family history research center. So it's a really busy, interesting place on peak days in the museum. People will lined up at this family history center to kind of try to unravel those family secrets.
Many secrets, I imagine. Yes. Dan, you are responsible for temporary and traveling exhibitions. Can you tell us about the temporary exhibitions at the museum this summer?
Trying to do different shows. Right now, we have a show about the Kosovar refugees arrived in 1999. That was the last the end of the breakup of Yugoslavia, when there were all those awful
Yeah.
ethnic cleansing wars in the former Yugoslavia, and then the Kosovar was locked in a brutal struggle with Serbia at that point. And there was the Canadian government at very short notice agreed to take 7,000 refugees from Kosovo in 1999, and there was a major military airlift, and the families were housed in Canadian military bases and then placed with families across the country. And so we have an exhibition that looks at the anniversary of Operation Parasol, it was called, that brought 7,000 Kosovar immigrants to Canada 25 years ago. and very successful. Those families integrated really well in Canada. When peace finally came to Kosovar, some of them went back, but actually most of them stayed in Canada. So we've got a lovely exhibit that looks at that experience. Later on this summer, on August the 1st, we're opening an exhibit on an unusual topic for Canadians, the history of slavery in Canada. Canadians are often kind of proud that we're a country who offered freedom, frequently to American slaves in the 1860s era through the Underground Railroad. But Canada had 2 centuries of slavery, right up until 1834. So we're doing an exhibition about people who came to Canada in chains and had to sort of survive living lives where they were enslaved to slaveholders in Canada and fought back with escape attempts and acts of resistance. So it's a chapter about Canadian immigration that most Canadians don't know about. So we're kind of trying to open eyes to 2 centuries of forced migration through slavery in Canada, which is kind of one of those darker chapters of the past. We always try hard to kind of balance the dark and the light in terms of immigration history. And that exhibit is opening on August the 1st, which in the former countries of the British Empire is called Emancipation Day. It was the August the 1st, 1834, was slavery was abolished across the British Empire, including Canada. And so it's kind of an anniversary date. And so that'll be an interesting eye-opening exhibit.
You mentioned August 1st, correct?
Yeah, Emancipation Day.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, Dan, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, and next year, I might mention we're doing a major big exhibit on food and immigration. How the Canadian diet has been shaped by waves of immigrants bringing food from their homeland that then become staples in North America, and that sort of interact with indigenous foods in Canada. Kind of the wild rice, maple syrup, the buffalo meat, and how that kind of blends with people bringing kind of grain and bread and pasta, and immigration has really kind of shaped the Canadian diet. And so that'll be a big tasty exhibit next year.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking with Dan Conlon of the Canadian Museum of Immigration. Is there anything else we haven't asked that you would like to add, Dan?
The attractions about kind of looking at immigration, it really gives you the story of a country kind of through one specific lens. And for Canada, built on immigration, the experiences of immigrants arriving, their interactions with Indigenous people who were here first, is really in many ways the story of Canada. So, and it's the story of North America too. Many of the themes that play out in the United States about people finding lives, dealing with racism, finding success, providing for the later generations. That's a story you see in Canada too. And it's a really window on the growth of North American society through this transformative experience of permanently arriving in another place. And I think that's what makes an immigration museum a really powerful experience for many visitors from all over.
How do Travel Itch Radio viewers learn more about the Canadian Museum of Immigration?
Well, we've got a wonderful website, pier21.ca, which has not only details about our exhibitions and our shows, but we also have an amazing selection of our collection, databases of ships that came to Pier 21, scholarly research on different aspects of the immigrant experience. So that's a wonderful kind of gateway to learn about Canada. We also have a great podcast. You'll see links to that on our website where we have people explore different immigration topics through podcast downloads. And Countless Journeys, it's called. That's another great way to learn about immigration in Canada. For those who haven't visited but will visit soon, our website offers all kinds of insights to the Canadian story through immigration.
Wow.
Our guest tonight on Travel Itch Radio has been Dan Conlon, curator of temporary and traveling exhibitions at the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21. Thank you so much for being our guest, Dan. And this is the 50th anniversary of the home run that broke Babe Ruth's record for Hank Aaron. We already had Father's Day, but now is your chance to share the spirit with my new biography, Home Run King, The Remarkable Record of Hank Aaron, featuring a foreword by Dusty Baker. This 265-page hardcover explores Aaron's contributions as both a home run hitter on and off the field, as an athlete and an advocate for civil rights. That's Home Run King, The Remarkable Record of Hank Aaron. Get it today on Amazon.com or come to my signing in Cooperstown on July 20th at the Baseball Hall of Fame. I'll be on Main Street from 11 to 1 in front of Willis Money Books. And that's it for this edition of Travelers Radio. This is Dan Schlossberg saying thank you for your time. This time until next time. Next week, same time, same place. We'll celebrate July 4th with a special interview. Roger Noriega interviews me about the Hank Aaron book. And there's lots of travel content in that book. For now, good night, stay safe, and thank you for joining us.